Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
And we're starting a new mini-series today, in which we're going to look at David Cameron's three big gambles with referendums as Prime Minister. The 2011 alternative vote referendum on the electoral system, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, which for my money, I must say, is by far and away the most significant and which had the chance to be the most consequential of the three votes we'll be talking about. And then we're going to build up with a crescendo to the 10-year anniversary of the Brexit referendum in 2016, the third and final referendum that David Cameron called. Final because it didn't just end Britain's membership of the European Union. Of course, it also ended David Cameron's time as Prime Minister.
And it's quite interesting in that just 5-year period from 2011 to 2016, we have three national referendums Britain, all delivered under the same Prime Minister. And other than that, there had been only one other UK-wide referendum, which was the 1975 referendum on whether or not to leave the European Economic Community. That was under Harold Wilson. Britain had been brought into the EEC by the Conservatives, by Edward Heath in 1973, and the Labour government, after the 1974 elections, gave the country an opportunity to vote out. The country chose to stay in. And then we didn't have another UK-wide referendum until this 2011 referendum. There had been regional referendums or national referendums. There had been referendums in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales. There had been referendums in the northeast of England. There had been other referendums on a more local level about whether or not to bring in directly elected mayors, but not one that brought together the whole of the UK. And the other curious thing about this 2011 referendum is I believe it's the only time in our adult lives, our entire lives, where you and I have voted in a British election on the same side. We've been opposed on pretty much every other election, but we did come together in 2011 against the alternative vote, not that we knew each other at the time. So perhaps to start us off, Lee, could you explain a little bit as to where this aspiration for a referendum on electoral reform came from?
Well, for some people, the idea that we would change our electoral system has been a bit of a long-standing dream. In particular, of course, it's been a dream for the bridesmaid of British politics. Well, for so long, the bridesmaid of British politics, the Liberal Democrats or their precursors, the Liberal Party or others, because electoral reform tends to have an appeal for those who cannot otherwise win under the rules as they are. So, of course, we have majority Labour governments in the last century. We have majority Conservative governments as well. But what we've never had is a majority Liberal government within the last century. And so for much of that time, it has been an ambition of the Liberals and the Lib Dems, but also some smaller parties as well. Nigel Farage and UKIP, for example, were advocates of electoral reform and in many ways got their foothold into British politics with a proportional system, the elections to the European Parliament after 1999. So it has been a bit of a recurring theme. It didn't come as a total bolt from the blue. And to put a bit of context into this for the Liberal Democrats, because they are really key to understanding why a referendum happens at this time. For the Lib Dems and their predecessor parties, if you take the elections between 1974 and 2005, they average about 19.4% of the vote, but they only average about 5% of the seats. As it happens, on a slight aside, that is no longer the case. The Liberal Democrat vote share in recent elections has been much lower than 19.4%, but in the last election, their share of the seats was much greater than 5%. So the historic grievance of the Lib Dems has actually gone away as of 2024, but not necessarily their commitment to electoral reform, because it is so in the bloodstream of the Liberal Democrats in this country to propose it. And basically what they have been arguing for a long time is the idea that Britain would change its system, ideally, in their view, to a proportional system, so we'd have some form of proportional representation. We don't want to suck all the life out of this episode by describing what all those possible alternatives may be, but our geekier listeners will know about the difference between the D'Hondt system or the single transferable vote or the additional member system, or so on and so forth. But there has for a long time been this general aspiration on the part of the Lib Dems to change the electoral system, and 2010 presents them with one of their better moments to try and force the issue. So, Richard, one of the first facts that we ought to establish is that the referendum we're building up to, this 2011 vote, is not on a proportional system. It is not to swap the system that we have otherwise, which is first past the post, for a proportional representation system. It's instead for something called the alternative vote. So before we really dig into the detail, can you just set out for us what is the alternative vote and how is it not proportional representation?
So the alternative vote, or AV as it's often called in Britain, is the same system as is called in many other parts of the world, especially in the United States, instant runoff voting. And it has two key characteristics. One is the election of legislators in single member districts, or single member constituency. So, in other words, there's only one person who is the winner, and that it's a ranked choice system. So, you can have ranked choice systems which have multiple members elected. Those are called the single transferable vote systems. Or you could have a system where there is no transfer of votes and a single member, and that's first past the post, but AV brings those together. In some alternative vote systems, voters are required to fill out the full ballot, give a number ranking to every single candidate on the ballot. And in other systems, voters are allowed to put as many preferences as they want, as long as they put down one. So if you want to vote, you've got 5 candidates, you could vote rankings 1 to 5, or you could just do 1 and 2, or 1, or whatever. In the proposed British system, there'd be no requirement to fill in all of the options. And this actually matters for one of the claims that the advocates of AV made in Britain, because they often would say in the 2011 referendum that this is a system that would guarantee that every MP in Britain would win 50% of the votes cast. And that's just inaccurate. It would guarantee that the winner would receive 50% of the votes that are counted at the final stage of counting. But under the AV system that was proposed, if a voter didn't fill in their full menu of choices and their preferences were knocked out, then their vote at a certain stage in the counting could just be metaphorically chucked in the bin. Now, AV is a preferential system, but not a proportional system. So as in first past the post, it's a constituency-based system, which makes no reference in the final number of MPs per party to the overall vote that a political party receives. There's no top-up, or there's no list or anything like that that translates national popular vote to seats in Parliament. AV is not widely used in parliamentary systems. At the time of the AV referendum, the 3 countries that used AV in their parliamentary elections were Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji. Now it's just Australia and Papua New Guinea. Fiji has moved to a different system. And those liberal advocates for proportional representation that you mentioned, Lee, were usually quite dismissive of AV because it has no aspirations to proportionality. Indeed, in the 2010 general election campaign, Nick Clegg dismissed AV, which was in the Labour Party manifesto, as, quote, a miserable little compromise.
Richard, you mentioned the Labour manifesto pledge in 2010, which is quite curious in all of this, really, because of the 3 parties going into the 2010 general election, you have the Conservative manifesto, which favours maintaining the first past the post system. You have the Liberal Democrat manifesto, which favours a more proportional electoral system. And then you have the Labour Party manifesto that favours the alternative vote. And the really curious thing about all of this is that it's the party that loses the election, the Labour Party, gets less than 30% of the vote. Gordon Brown is kicked out as Prime Minister. it's the policy that was in that party's manifesto that ends up happening, not the policy that is in the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats who come together to form a coalition. So what's the background to how Labour seemingly became converted to AV going into 2010?
Well, Gordon Brown became a late convert to electoral reform, not PR. I think that's important to say. As the Labour government that he was leading started to approach a general election, and the polls were not looking good for Labour. And the Liberal Democrats were doing quite well in the polls, getting 15 to 20, even higher than that in the polls. And Brown was interested in bringing down the Lib Dems' support. And one way that Brown thought that he could peel away Lib Dem voters to the Labour fold was for the Labour Party to promise some form of electoral reform. And indeed, not even to necessarily just promise some form of electoral reform, but actually to start the legislative process for bringing about electoral reform. So at the very tail end of that government, at the end of 2009 and in 2010, the Brown Labour government starts to bring forward legislation that would legislate for a referendum on the alternative vote. And there was some debate, first of all, as to whether or not that was a good idea. Interestingly, given where we are right now in British politics, according to Anthony Seldon and Guy Lodge in their book Brown at 10, one of the more vocal opponents of electoral reform in that Labour government was a chap called Andy Burnham. And we know that Burnham publicly in the 2010 Labour leadership contest was quite sceptical of a referendum on electoral reform. He said, "Those who are calling for the retention of first past the post are making an incredibly important and legitimate argument." He goes on to say that electoral reform is, quote, "a kind of fringe pursuit for Guardian reading classes." In spite of Andy Burnham's apparent objections, Cabinet, Brown moves ahead. The next question is, what is the electoral reform that the Labour government would propose? And the initial thought was that the Labour government would support a system called AV Plus. Now, AV Plus was a system that had been proposed to Tony Blair at the very start of the new Labour government, when Labour came in with a promise to review the electoral system. They put the former SDP leader Roy Jenkins in charge of this review called the Jenkins Commission. And Roy Jenkins came up with this idea of AV Plus. What is AV Plus? Well, AV Plus is actually very similar to the system that is currently used in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament, or in Germany, or in New Zealand. It's what's called a mixed member proportional system, or an additional member system, where voters get two ballots. They get their party list ballot and they get their constituency ballot. Now, in, say, Scotland, that constituency ballot is basically a first past the post ballot. But what Roy Jenkins wanted was that the constituency ballot would be AV, would be a instant runoff ranked choice voting ballot. So you've got AV for the constituency, and you've got a party list system, which is meant to bring in the proportionality element into the system. Initially, the thought from the Brown government was, well, we'll just pick up where Roy Jenkins left off and we can bring that in. But then it was observed that if you were going to do that, you would have to completely redraw the constituency boundaries in the United Kingdom. Why? Well, because if you're bringing in this cadre of list MPs, let's say half the MPs are elected on a list, then you've got to cut the number of constituencies in half, which means that each constituency has to have double the number of people in it that it previously would have had, which means you'll have to have a massive boundary review. And possibly those constituencies on a much larger scale would not necessarily be too favourable to Labour. Little caveat there. So then it was decided, well, scrap AV Plus, let's just have AV. Let's just keep our parliamentary constituencies as they are, but rather than first past the post, we use this ranked choice system. And then there was some discussion about holding a referendum on the alternative vote in May of 2010, on the same day as the general election. And the thought behind this was that this could be a very powerful tool for the Brown Labour government to go to Lib Dem voters and say, don't feel you need to vote Lib Dem to bring in electoral reform. We're literally giving you a vote on electoral reform in this election. So you can go in and you can vote yes to AV and yes to Gordon Brown and the Labour government. There had been some research that had been done which had suggested that about a third of Liberal Democrat voters, so about 8% of the overall electorate, would be willing to switch from Lib Dem to Labour, which could be very decisive in potentially even keeping Labour in government. So that was the thought process, but the civil service apparently intervened and basically said there's no time to pass the legislation setting up a referendum, to identify what the referendum campaigns would be, to set in all of that kind of infrastructure that's necessary for a referendum campaign before we have the general election. And so that's why that referendum didn't happen under Labour, but it was put into the Labour manifesto.
Labour thinking around this time is really all over the place. And it seems like the desperate spasms of a party that just expects to lose an election and is fumbling around for a way to try and recover some votes. One of the ways in which I think it's confused is, first of all, if somebody presented to Gordon Brown and others an example that said that if the Labour government were to do a referendum on a non-PR form of electoral reform, that it would have brought potentially 8% of the electorate into their column from the Liberal Democrats. I mean, that just does not pass the sniff test. For me, the idea that the issue is so salient for 8% of the country that it would switch them into voting for a deeply unpopular incumbent government in this election, I think is just a staggeringly daft claim, really. And I'm sure there may have been a spreadsheet that said it, but it just doesn't pass the sniff test for me at all, that it would have been that transformative, not least because this is the immediate aftermath of a financial crisis. The country's been in recession, and we're meant to assume that the great battle to go from first past the post to AV is very high salience with lots of voters. I mean, I just do not believe it for a moment.
And also, I just think it's silly thinking, because if you've already given people the referendum, then why would they feel they needed to vote Labour to get the referendum, right? I mean, if they are Liberal Democrats, they can vote in the referendum and they can stick to the Liberal Democrats. So it just didn't make any sense to me.
The other way in which I think it's quite odd is that the way in which electoral reform is most likely to get onto the agenda is in the event of a hung parliament. And going into 2010, hung parliament was a very realistic likelihood from that election. In fact, it is, of course, what we ended up with. And the Conservatives won just over 300 seats, but were 24 or so shy of the seats that they needed to win a majority. And so the odd thing that Labour have done, in a sense, is they've almost shown their first hand for future coalition negotiations in their own manifesto. So they've already conceded a referendum of some sort, and therefore the Liberal Democrats have room to try and drag them more to their ideal position. I want to come on to those coalition negotiations because they dominate the days after the 2010 general election. And it's not worth relitigating everything about those negotiations because Richard and I have disagreed about them before. But certainly what you get is a situation in which senior people within the Conservative Party and senior people within the Liberal Democrats both take the view that the only way to have a stable coalition is if the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats work together. You could have some sort of rainbow coalition of the other parties, but it doesn't get you a working majority. And any arrangement that would have come up from Labour and the Lib Dems would not have lasted the full 5 years, as the coalition eventually did. So really, I think what's going on in these days, just after the 2010 election, is the Lib Dems are thinking, well, what can we get out of the Conservatives on electoral reform? To begin with, the Conservatives offer a commission on electoral reform, but the Liberal Democrats have had their fingers burned on that in the past with this Jenkins Commission and Tony Blair, which didn't emerge out of coalition negotiations so much as Blair's pandering to a certain set of voters. But nevertheless, they'd been promised something, the commission happened, and then there was no further action, and the dream temporarily died. So where those coalition negotiations get to is that the Conservatives decide that, well, we can live with electoral reform being part of the agenda if it's not a proportional version of electoral reform. So AV starts to appeal, and if it's not just going to be government legislation, it's going to be subject to some sort of vote, i.e., a referendum. And also if the parties can divide on it. So it's not going to be a situation where there's a collective view or cabinet collective responsibility. The different parties of the coalition can decide what their respective views will be. And it's in that context that David Cameron decides that agreeing to an alternative vote referendum, whilst it comes with a real risk that the Conservatives end up with an electoral system that many Tories do not think will be to their liking and do not think will help them stay in government, it will at least get them into government as part of a coalition with the Lib Dems.
And you're rightly from the side of Labour's negotiations with the Lib Dems. I mean, the first thing to say is that the Lib Dems were not serious about going into government with Labour. As I've said on this podcast before, it was very obvious to anyone who cared to pay attention to what Nick Clegg was saying in the lead up to the 2010 general election, that he was dead set on going into government with the Conservatives and David Cameron. And so the Lib Dems just didn't take the negotiations seriously. Now, one of the accounts that I've read of these negotiations is that because Labour had already put the starting point at having a referendum on AV, the Lib Dems tried to move Labour into introducing electoral reform without a referendum. And apparently one of the suggestions that the Lib Dems had was, why don't we start by introducing AV only at by-elections? So if an MP resigned or died, that in those elections only, we would have voters ranking their choices, but we would need a referendum in order to bring it in at the time of the next general election. A sort of silly and absurd suggestion from a party that just wasn't serious about actually engaging with Labour in the programme of government, in my view.
So the referendum is agreed as part of the coalition plan for government, and it's actually going to happen very early in the Parliament. So it's agreed for May of 2011, 1 year basically into the government, and on the same day as local elections in England and also devolved elections in Scotland and Wales.
And it's interesting from some of the accounts in the referendum that there is some grumpiness from the political parties about having the vote on the same day as the local elections, because they view this referendum as a bit of a distraction from the real business of winning councillors in local authorities. And I do think it's quite interesting that that mindset of really what we need to focus on is the council elections, not this massive national referendum. I actually heard the same thing in the 2016 referendum. I can remember campaigning in Cambridge, where I was living at the time. And in that case, the Brexit referendum was about 6 weeks after the local elections. And I can remember canvassers, Labour canvassers and organisers saying, don't get distracted by the EU referendum. The real focus is on the local elections. And they saw the referendum as a bit of a distraction.
It is slightly curious. I mean, if I try and put myself into the mindset of an anti-AV person at the time, I would have been a little skeptical about having it on the same day as these other votes, partly because in Scotland and Wales, you have elections for devolved parliaments that use PR systems. They are higher turnout than local elections in England. And you could have the concern that parts of the UK where they already use a non-first past the post system for major elections might be more inclined to vote for electoral reform than England. And by having them on the same day as these other votes, you're baking in to the expected turnout a proportionally higher number of Scottish and Welsh voters than you are English voters. And there are reasons not to have multiple votes on the same day. For example, of course, the Brexit referendum, as we'll come on to discuss, is on its own day. The Scottish independence referendum is on its own day, in that case in September, the Brexit vote in June. And in the past, the scheduled dates for Scottish Parliament elections have been changed so as not to clash with Westminster general elections. So there is an argument very often when you have these big questions being put to voters, they should get their own space in the national debate. in the lead up to it. So it is in some ways quite curious that they chose not to do that. What I can only think was partly going through people's minds is that this is, in fact, without sounding unkind, a bit of an Anavax issue, really, electoral reform. The people who care about it a lot, but the people who care about it aren't necessarily enough to fill Wembley Stadium, let alone to boost turnout to a respectable level all over the country. So I can only assume that part of what went on was that they feared a very low turnout if this was the only question being put on the day.
I would guess that was part of it. My other theory on this is that the Lib Dems may have thought that having the referendum on the ballot would motivate more kind of liberal-minded, pro-electoral reform people to come out and vote, and then to vote Liberal Democrat as a byproduct of that. I mean, as it happens, I think what possibly did happen in the AV referendum is it may have motivated some conservatives to come out and vote, to vote against electoral reform, and then to vote for a Conservative council candidate. It's one of the extraordinary things about the 2011 local elections is that the number of Conservative councillors and Conservative-controlled councils goes up, which is unusual for a party in government. You just have to look at the terrible electoral fortunes of Labour under Keir Starmer since Labour entered government in the 2025 and 26 local elections. Whereas for David Cameron, the Tories gained 4 councils in 2011. They gained 86 councillors. And the people who did very badly were the Liberal Democrats, who lost 9 councils and 748 councillors.
So in each of these episodes, we're going to talk a little bit about how the campaign is structured, because it's not just some kind of Wild West when you have a referendum campaign. In some ways, it's actually a more ordered affair than party elections, because you have official designated campaigns. Sometimes the battle to be one of those can be almost as fierce and contentious as the battle between those ultimate official campaigns. And the amount of money that they can spend is capped. The amount of money that non-official campaigns can spend, which is usually much lower, is capped. And in these recent referendums, there was also a pot of money that the campaigns get from the national government as well to support their efforts. So in this case, the official campaigns have spending limits of £5 million for the referendum. And they also get some, we could think of them, I suppose, as donations in kind, in effect. Party political broadcasts on TV on behalf of the official campaigns, free postage for direct mail shots to go to voters, and also free use of public buildings as well for events, in this case, to try and encourage a bit of dialogue and debate about the issues. So, Richard, I want to come on to thinking about how those campaigns operated and how they tried to win the battle for ideas. To put this discussion in context, I think it's worth saying if you go about 8 weeks out from polling day in 2011, the polling looks as if roughly a third of people favour changing the electoral system, roughly a third of people are against changing the electoral system, and roughly a third of people still have no opinion on it. And even when you make adjustments for who is most likely to turn out, there's no obvious majority, either for or against, and there's a great deal of apathy. So I think this is a campaign where either campaign, if you're going from 8 to 10 weeks out from polling day, could win. And the quality of their arguments and how they make their pitch is going to be really important. So to begin looking at the campaigns, Richard, what was the approach of the Yes to AV campaign?
Well, you're absolutely right, Lee, that the polling on this showed a lot more volatility in the electorate than I think we are probably accustomed to where we're sat now, at least when it comes to things like Brexit, and people feel very deeply entrenched in their Brexit tribes. But actually, there weren't very deeply entrenched pro and anti-AV tribes, except at the sort of most animated activist level. But in the broad public, there was still a lot of potential movement in the polls, as the polls in fact played out. Now, I think my view is that the Yes campaign, so this is what I think they call themselves the Yes to Fairer Votes campaign, or the Yes to AV campaign, they came in with a very complacent mindset. And that mindset was informed by the feeling that there was an anti-politics mood in Britain, There had been a consequence of the expenses scandal, the MP's expenses scandal, which we've done a past episode on, where the public felt that MPs had cheated the system and fiddled the system to their own advantage. And so if people are not feeling very favorably disposed to MPs, then maybe they'll want to bring in a new system that in theory would bring in more responsive MPs. Now, in practice, it's not clear to me at all that AV would deliver more responsive or representative or less crooked MPs, but I think that was the broad assumption that the AV campaign had. A second problem that the Yes to AV campaign had is that they were really caught up in their own sense of self-righteousness. They believed that they were on the side of good. They were on the right side of history. Britain had become an international outlier in its use of first past the post for parliamentary elections. Britain would want to follow the arc of history as it bends towards electoral reform. And this was admitted actually by some of the pro-electoral reform campaigners. Lewis Bastian and Ken Ritchie, in their book Don't Take No for an Answer, admit, quote, "The fundamental flaw of the Yes campaign was self-delusion. It imagined itself at the head of a national popular movement, and groupthink set in early." So that's another issue. A third issue of the Yes to AV campaign is that it was very narrow in its construction of who it wanted to be the face of that campaign. It was basically a campaign of liberals and lovies. And the AV campaign was not paying much attention to trying to bring in voices from the right onto the campaign. They could have brought in Nigel Farage. Farage, the leader of UKIP at the time, was a supporter of electoral reform, but the Yes to Fairer Votes campaign wanted to keep Farage out of the picture. They made, as far as I can tell, very, very little effort to bring in Conservatives. Not a single Conservative MP ended up backing AV, even though I've read that there was some thought that even some Conservative cabinet ministers might back AV. Michael Gove has apparently said that he was considering backing AV as a way of showing some goodwill for the Liberal Democrats in the coalition, and also as a way of trying to slightly detoxify his unfortunate image that he had already accumulated as being a reforming education minister. But in the end, Gove, like all of the other Conservative MPs, did not come out in favour of AV. Ultimately, this was a narrow-minded, arrogant, and self-delusional campaign, which snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, in my view. I mean, they didn't even use, you mentioned, Lee, they got free postage. They didn't even use their full allowance of free post, while the No campaign sent out 40 million leaflets to households for free. The Yes campaign only sent out about 8 million.
It is an example of just a very weak issue-based campaign in terms of how they made their case, because there are some arguments you can make for AV. In fact, there are some actually quite small c conservative arguments you can make for AV. You can say that it has some benefits without having the drawbacks of non-majoritarian voting systems or some forms of PR, but they didn't really seem to make them. It instead always struck me as being captured by people who really wanted PR and were zealots for PR, and that's fine, perfectly respectable view to take, albeit not mine. And in one sense, their heart wasn't really in it because they weren't getting what they actually wanted. But in another sense, they spoke about it almost as if they were. They tried to attribute to AV almost grander and bolder transformation than it actually would have delivered for the electoral system. Some of the things you mentioned at the very outset about how saying, "Oh, this will guarantee majority support in constituencies." Well, it wouldn't. Some people spoke about how it would do away with safe seats as part of this referendum. Well, it wouldn't. Basically would do very little for to do away with safe seats. In fact, in many places where there are Conservatives versus Labour in first and second, there are arguments to say that AV can enhance how safe a seat is rather than undermine it. So it does end up really not really making the arguments that it needs to in the right way, not really appealing to enough of the country. And without sounding too unkind, when you said it was the keenest advocates for electoral reform plus the lovies, you see the list of supporters, and it does rather feel that way. So Helena Bonham Carter, Billy Bragg, Melvin Bragg, John Cleese, Steve Coogan, Colin Firth, Stephen Fry, Eddie Izzard, Joanna Lumley, John O'Farrell, Polly Toynbee, Richard Wilson. I mean, it does slightly have that kind of, nothing against them all individually, but if you're trying to create a campaign that has mass appeal to the sorts of people who you need to win in a national referendum, that gives you some reach, but that does not give you 50% plus one.
And even there, with the use of their supporters, some of that ended up backfiring because during the campaign, they put out a leaflet of some of these celebrity backers. But it turned out that in their leaflets in London, they put the poet Benjamin Zephaniah on the leaflets. Zephaniah is of Jamaican heritage. But for the leaflets they put out in the rest of the country, they took Zephaniah out of the leaflet. And such a stupid and also racist thing to do, to presume that there's not going to be anyone who will compare what the leaflet in the home counties looks like versus the leaflet in London. So it was just, in my view, a very poorly run campaign.
Well, let's come on to the campaign that really wins the plaudits when people look back on the referendum, and that's the No to AV campaign. So what was their approach?
The No to AV campaign was a much smarter campaign for a few reasons. So one of the things that No to AV put at the center of their campaign was the costs of changing the electoral system. Now, this is a somewhat counterintuitive or unlikely complaint against a new electoral system. Ultimately, any electoral system carries some baked-in costs because you need people to run the election. And it's not necessarily obvious that the voting systems is where governments can find savings compared to something like the pension bill or the welfare bill or the defense budget. But No to AV put out this claim that changing the electoral system would cost Britain £250 million. Now, this is a somewhat dubious number. The way that they got to this number is they calculated the costs of the referendum, which obviously is a bit dubious because the costs are going to be there whether or not we change the electoral system. There was also built into that the costs of what it would be to buy electronic voting machines for every polling station in Britain. Not clear that you would need to have electronic voting machines to bring in AV. It might help speed up the counting, but it's not clear that it would have been required. But the genius of it was that when the Yes campaign complained about all of these technical elements, what were they doing? They were reminding voters of this number, £250 million, and they were raising the salience of the cost of the change. So rather than talking about the representational benefits of AV, they're on the terrain of the No campaign, which is about this is going to cost a lot of money, whether it's £250 million or £50 million, there's some kind of cost associated with it in the eyes of the voters.
Comparisons to 2016 and £350 million a week written on the side of a bus will already be running through listeners' minds. And it's perhaps relevant at this stage to say that the chief of the No to AV campaign is somebody called Matthew Elliott, who will be interviewing about his new book and a summer episode of the podcast soon. He is the same person who goes on to be chief exec of the Leave campaign, the Vote Leave campaign in 2016. And I think you can see some similar pages from the playbook of both referendums being applied there.
Yes, and so the No to AV version of the £350 million on the side of the bus in the 2016 EU referendum were these posters that went round the country and in newspapers showing crying babies with the caption, "She needs a maternity unit, not an alternative voting system," or a picture of a soldier saying, "He needs bulletproof vests, not an alternative voting system. So that was one clever move. A second clever move of the AV campaign was to focus on the Liberal Democrats. As I mentioned, the Liberal Democrats did very badly in the council elections on the same day as the AV vote, and there was a real move against the Liberal Democrats in the public after they went into government with the Conservatives. And the figure of Nick Clegg in particular had become synonymous with the idea of a lying politician who would say anything to get into power. And so by focusing on Clegg, the No campaign somewhat diffused this kind of anti-politics sentiment that the Yes campaign wanted to focus on. And also the Yes campaign didn't help itself by having all these elite people as the front of the Yes campaign. So if it's meant to be this populist anti-elite position to vote for electoral reform, it doesn't really quite work when you've got the establishment all saying this is a good idea. And so the No campaign put out posters saying that under AV, you would have a voting system that would deliver a President Clegg. Now, that's obviously in of itself a nonsense claim, but the underlying idea behind that is that AV would make the Liberal Democrats kingmakers because it would result more likely in more frequent coalition governments than under first past the post, which I think is true. And I think is true that the Liberal Democrats would be the main beneficiaries of a system that delivered constant hung parliaments because, as David Blunkett said in 2010, the Liberal Democrats behave like every harlot in history, and they go and find the highest bidder to do the dirty deed. The third bit of genius of the No to AV campaign, in stark contrast to the Yes to AV campaign, they wanted to be much broader in their political and ideological makeup. And so you get people on the right of politics who are campaigning for No to AV, but you also get people on the left of politics, including the very far left, like Dennis Skinner and Jeremy Corbyn are No to AV people, just as you have people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Cameron and George Osborne all campaigning against AV as well. And that was put into the structure of the No to AV campaign. So every sort of role was balanced out between a person on the right and the left. So you had as the director, Matthew Elliott, who you mentioned, but then you also had as the deputy director, Joan Ryan, who had been a London Labour MP. And the idea that the No to AV campaign, I think, really wanted to do was behind the scenes lock down the Tories, make sure you don't get any Tories that peel away to Yes to AV, and they're very successful in that. Use Tory money to fund the No to AV campaign because Labour has said that it will be officially neutral in the campaign, so you can't really rely on Labour funds. But in terms of public-facing activity, to put Labour people much more prominently at the fore of the campaign. Why? Because it was seen that the Labour electorate was probably the more swing electorate in this campaign compared to Tories who were much more inclined against and Lib Dems who were much more inclined to be in favour.
It's a very effective strategy. I mean, those three prongs do really stand out in my mind. The money point, important to say in the context of this, that in the years leading up to this, there had been scandals about underfunding for the armed forces. And of course, the NHS was a highly salient issue. You mentioned that poster about maternity care. It's a highly salient issue always. It was very highly salient at this time as well because of allegations of cuts in its budget. I think they also found some quite good ways to just discredit the system as well as a model in a way that jarred with what they could pitch as being the essential fairness of an electoral system. So, of course, the Yes campaign, literally called Yes to Fairer Votes, theirs was all meant to be about fairness. But then the No to AV campaign showed, I think, really quite effectively that you could have somebody who gets the most first preferences who doesn't win, and that there's an argument that is just fundamentally unfair. That there's a reason why being first past the post affords you the victor status. And also, and this was something that was made a lot of at the time, that it doubly empowers or potentially triply or quadruply empowers people who vote for fringe parties. I remember there being some discussion, and again, to drag us back to the 2011 context, the BNP had been the British National Party, a far-right party, had been a big deal around this time. They'd got elected to the European Parliament in 2009. And so there was
Thanks, thanks to proportional representation.
yeah. And so the comment that was being made was that, well, if somebody goes in and votes BNP, AV isn't going to mean that they win or that they get seats in Parliament. But that BNP voter, once their candidate is knocked out, their second preference then gets counted. And then potentially their third preference, if that person gets knocked out, etc. So you end up with a system where if you have the good sense, shall we say, to vote for a mainstream party, who where you live are going to be in the top two, then your vote is never going to get redistributed. You're only going to get one bite of the cherry and you've had it with your first preference. But vote for the monster raving loony party or some other variation of loons, and your vote is getting counted multiple times. Some people will dissent from that framing of it, but that was part of how the No campaign did put it across, and they were quite successful in doing so. In terms of thinking about the political parties and our senior politicians, of course, these two campaigns, yes and no, are sitting outside of the political parties themselves. But what you do have is you have the Conservative Party, who are pretty much top to bottom united. There's practically uniformity among the parliamentary party in campaigning for no, and also a great majority of Conservative voters as well. On the other side of the debate, things are a little bit less homogenous for the Lib Dems, but they're also pretty much there. The Lib Dem leadership and Lib Dem MPs are for it. Lib Dem voters are rather more split, I think in part because some of them are actually never that big fans of electoral reform to begin with, in part because some of them want something better, actual PR. But nevertheless, there is, at the party level, quite strong uniformity among the Lib Dems. The party that is totally chaotically split is the Labour Party, which, as a party, chooses to be neutral on the question. But of course, the Labour leader, Ed Miliband, isn't neutral. He, in fact, calls for a yes vote for AV. So really, what's going on within the Labour Party at this time where it can't bring itself to have a united position?
Well, I guess within Labour, there are two fundamental divisions in the party between those who believe in the dream, or I would say the delusion, of a progressive alliance in politics, where Labour would work with other so-called progressive parties to keep out Conservative governments, and those who, like me, believe that the Labour Party should be a broad church party of the left, that the party itself is the coalition, and that the purpose of the Labour Party is to win majority government and to deliver on the manifesto promises that we campaign on at a general election. Now, at this time, the case for the idea of this progressive alliance looked pretty weak. Why? Because this so-called progressive party, the Liberal Democrats, had just a year before gone into coalition with the Conservatives. And I would point out that that is much more the habit of the Liberals to go into coalition with Conservatives than it is to go into coalition with Labour in UK governments.
On that point, it's maybe worth just saying about AV and how that may cut across this idea of a progressive alliance between Lib Dems and Labour. John Curtis has written about what would Lib Dem voters have done in different elections if they had a second preference. And basically, they just look a lot like the average voter. At times when the Conservatives were popular, say in the 1980s, then the second preference of a lot of SDP and Liberal voters was the Conservatives. During Tony Blair's time, the second preference of Lib Dems was more often than not Tony Blair. No, they did not look like a voter group which was consistently on the side of Labour as a second preference and part of some sort of progressive alliance. They're basically floating voters in terms of their second preference. So whilst it may seem a bit unkind to call it a delusion on the grounds of perhaps dismissing them as being more inclined to Tories, they're certainly not consistently inclined as a voter group to the Labour Party either.
No, they're not. I think it's really unfortunate that advocates for PR within Labour have this view that the Lib Dems are a pro-Labour party. I mean, we can go back through the history of the Liberal Party. The Liberals have only ever been in peacetime coalitions with the Conservatives. Lloyd George in coalition with the Conservatives in the 1920s, and Nick Clegg in coalition with the Conservatives in the 2010s. And so there was huge anger in Labour at Clegg and the Lib Dems for the coalition. And the Labour no to AV message was, quote, the only vote that would count under AV would be Nick Clegg's. And so I think that was really important in mobilising Labour MPs and Labour members and Labour voters against AV. It was actually sort of coming almost at a perfect time for those who opposed a change to the electoral system. So 2/3 of Labour MPs opposed changing the electoral system. And it's a really diverse mix of Labour MPs. I'll just share some of the names who remain, I think, familiar to some of us today. So I mentioned Jeremy Corbyn was no to AV. Lindsay Hoyle, the current Speaker, was no to AV. Shabana Mahmood, the current Home Secretary, was no to AV. Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor, were no to AV. Dennis Skinner, the veteran left-wing Labour MP. Emily Thornberry, the camp backbench Labour MP. Jenny Chapman, who's currently a very close advisor of the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, was no to AV. Gisela Stewart, the Eurosceptic Labour MP, was no to AV. Tristram Hunt, a much more kind of pro-European, right-wing former Labour MP, now the head of the Victoria and Albert Museums, was no to AV. And Caroline Flint, one of my favourite Labour MPs, was a very prominent no campaigner. So you had a lot of MPs across the board, and for some very serious big beasts in the party were sort of at the front of the No to AV campaign. Margaret Beckett was the president of No to AV. David Blunkett, John Reid, John Prescott, big figures in the New Labour cabinet were at the forefront of campaigning against AV. Many of the unions were also against AV, the GMB, Unite, Community, ASLEF. Unison, the public sector union, was neutral. And the CWU, the Postal Communication Workers Union, was pro. But that all being said, I don't want to minimize the fact that there were many prominent yes to AV Labour campaigners. A third of Labour MPs supported changing the electoral system, including, as you mentioned, Lee, Ed Miliband, the leader, his brother, David Miliband, who at that point still hadn't gone off to America. People who are in the cabinet today, like Hilary Benn, Sadiq Khan, now Mayor of London, Ed Balls, who was the Shadow Chancellor, now does something on some other podcast, was also yes to AV. And some unlikely people as well were yes to AV. People I sort of hadn't realised were yes to AV, like Frank Field and John Cruddas and Jack Straw were all yes to AV. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. But I think the unpopularity of the Lib Dems, the fact that the Progressive Alliance coalition argument wasn't very operable at that time, is really what helped to swing the argument in Labour to the no side at that moment.
So the question is put on the 5th of May 2011, and the ballot paper says, at present, the UK uses the first past the post system to elect MPs to the House of Commons. Should the alternative vote system be used instead? And 6.15 million people vote for yes. That works out at 32%. And 13 million people vote no, which works out at 68%, on a turnout of about 42% of the electorate. A couple of observations I wanted to make at the beginning of it. One is that it's a landslide. Right? That is a very, very decisive vote. And it's one of the reasons actually why I think only now, and we're 15 years on from this referendum, are some people beginning to speak slightly more confidently about the prospects of electoral reform again. Because I think for much of the last 15 years, it basically killed stone dead the question of changing the voting system. And it's taken the fragmentation of 2 and a bit party politics into, as discussed a great deal recently, 5 or 7 party politics in Great Britain to really make it seem as if it's even a legitimate question to ask again, given the strength of this result.
the point about the question is interesting, Lee, because with this referendum, it isn't like they have some very well established set of words as to what to put on the ballot. And again, another sign of the arrogance or incompetence of the Yes campaign is that they didn't even submit evidence to the Electoral Commission as to what they thought would be good language for the question. They, I think, just presumed that whatever the question would be, they would win it. Whereas the No campaigners were much more attentive to that. And I think there's a certain argument that the way that the question is set up, where it's prefaced with, at present, the UK uses the first past the post system to elect MPs to the House of Commons, sounds quite authoritative and maybe reassuring in the way that it's put, which might have a modest or mild status quo bias.
I tend to think it's a perfectly straightforward question, really. We'll come on in the next episode about 2014 in Scotland to talk about the way in which the phrasing of the question became hugely important, just as it did, in fact, in the Brexit referendum as well. I think this is a pretty straightforward question, really. What's quite interesting about it is that within this overwhelming landslide result, you do get a few places that vote yes to AV, and they include Oxford, Cambridge, some parts of London like Camden and Islington, Hackney and Haringey, and also two bits of Scotland, the central part of Edinburgh and Glasgow, Kelvin. And one thing I think we'll, towards the end of this mini-series, try and draw some of the threads together. But one of the things that I remember coming out after 2011, particularly, I think because Oxford and Cambridge both voted yes and the vast majority of the country voted no, is there were the hints, sometimes rather more than hints, of the idea that, well, the well-educated people, of course, all voted yes. And it was, going to parody the viewpoint a little bit, the great unwashed beyond who voted no and denied us this. Now, I don't think that had quite the same purchase or resonance as it would after 2016, where that became quite a toxic view, I think, that some people had about how different classes and different educational backgrounds and different ages had voted. But I think there was some element of that which was prevented from becoming too prominent simply by the scale of the defeat.
And just to emphasize, that scale is extraordinary. Out of 440 counting areas, 430 were majority no. It's just those 10, 6 in London, 2 others in England, Cambridge and Oxford, and those 2 others in Scotland, one of which I should mention, Glasgow, Kelvin, is where Roy Jenkins was an MP. It contains the Hillhead part of Glasgow where he was the MP for Glasgow Hillhead. They're the only ones that vote yes.
Well, to wrap this episode up, my sort of final thought really is that it's easy to think there's not a great deal to take away or to learn or remember about the 2011 AV referendum. But I think it gives us the template for how, if the question is to be put again about changing the electoral system, that will come about. Because it's not out of the realms of possibility. You could argue it's in fact quite likely that the next election produces no majority party. And it's also not impossible, if there's some form of Labour recovery from their current polling position, that they have 250, 260 seats, that the Lib Dems have roughly what they have now, and that there's a great deal of pressure for a Lib-Lab pact. And I struggle to imagine that one of the absolute red lines for that, which is arguably somewhat ironic given the way Lib Dem MPs now broadly reflect Lib Dem vote share, but never mind. As I said at the outset, it's so in the Lib Dem bloodstream, a belief in electoral reform. It's hard to imagine, for me, that the price of coalition and for propping up Labour wouldn't be getting some sort of commitment on electoral reform, whether that's by referendum or just by a statute. But I would suspect not just an attempt at AV, but almost certainly an attempt at PR. And so I think in that sense, what came out of the 2010 negotiations and what happened in 2011 offers a framework for how the question of changing the electoral system will most likely shoot up the political agenda in the future.
And I have just 2 final reflections, one personal and one more historical. So the personal reflection is that in this referendum, I wasn't a particularly active campaigner. I didn't knock on doors or deliver leaflets for the no to AV side, but I did speak in a debate against the Liberal Democrats about AV. I was at the time chair of the Cambridge University Labour Club, and so there was a debate in which the yes to AV side was represented by, I think, two student Liberal Democrats, and the no to AV side was myself as the chair of the Labour Club, and I think it was a secretary of the Cambridge University Conservative Association. I was also invited to go on to the No to AV double-decker battle bus, and I turned it down because it was clashing with my studies, which was probably the sensible thing to do, but it would have been nice to have chalked up that memory. The political observation or historical observation I wanted to make was about what David Cameron learned from this referendum. In thinking about this series, this was a huge victory for David Cameron. He managed to kill off what would have been one of the most durable constitutional legacies of going into government with the Liberal Democrats. As it's turned out, really the only, I think, two durable constitutional legacies of that coalition government are the recall of MPs and the changes to the line of succession for the British Crown, ending male primogeniture, which is quite a remarkable thing, really. That's all the Liberal Democrats got out of going into coalition with the Conservatives for the most part. And yet he managed to win big on this, put to bed for a very long time at least, for the rest of his time as Prime Minister, the question of electoral reform, to get 2/3 of the vote for his position, and managed to keep his coalition government going. Quite a remarkable set of political accomplishments. But what I think that did also do, which was quite bad, was it gave David Cameron a taste for the referendum as a political gambling device. And it got him maybe hooked on the idea that when he gets into political trouble, the way to get around that or the way to defeat his internal or external opponents is to put it to a referendum, helps to explain his decisions in 2013 and 14 to support and commit to referendums on Scotland and Europe, which obviously in the case of Europe, he doesn't put into effect until 2016, but it's actually in that first government when he's in coalition where he already comes out in favour of an in-out EU referendum. And I think that the AV referendum, now mostly forgotten, except by political anoraks like us, actually plays a really important role in setting up the Brexit referendum.
We finish as ever with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment, and I'll go first. So I've been dipping recently into a book called 60 Years of Power by the Earl of Swinton. Now, the Earl of Swinton is a remarkable man in 20th century Conservative history. He took part in 11 governments and sat in 10 cabinets. He was there around the table with Lloyd George, and he knew very well people like Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas Hume. He quite literally knew them all. He's the Giles Brandreth of an earlier age, so to speak. And one of the things I quite like about this book is it's basically a written up set of interviews, but put into prose, of his personal reflections on these people. And sometimes they jar with some of the ways in which people think of them otherwise. And he has different accounts than that which has been established quite often in history. What got me looking at this book is that when I was in the Bodleian looking at Harold Wilson's papers quite recently for his book, A Prime Minister on Prime Ministers, I noticed that he had chapters of this photocopied when he was writing about some of them. So he was referring back to what the Earl of Swinton said and clearly valuing that insight. And having read quite a few of these chapters now, and they cover, for example, Balfour, Lloyd George, Bonar Law, Baldwin, MacDonald, Chamberlain, Churchill, Attlee, Eden, Macmillan, and Douglas Hume, and then a couple of other miscellaneous chapters. I can see why Wilson found them valuable, because they do offer a personal and, yes, in one sense, therefore partial perspective, but an interesting perspective on some of the greats of the first half or so of the last century. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, the book I want to recommend to listeners for this episode is the book by Jasper Miles called The Labour Party and Electoral Reform, which has on it a wonderful photo of the Labour No to AV campaigners. And on that picture, you see Caroline Flint, a figure of the more kind of old Labour right, and Dennis Skinner, a figure of the old Labour left, stood side by side. And next to Caroline Flint is Doug Hoyle, the father of Lindsay Hoyle, the current speaker, and lots of other Labour figures on it. This book tells you the whole history of Labour's attitudes on electoral reform from the very start of the 20th century right up to the 2020s. Jasper has done a great deal of archival research, and also he's interviewed some of the players who are on both sides of the electoral reform debate within the Labour Party in the last 30 and 40 years. So it really is, I think, the definitive text which shows that the Labour Party has never been a party of electoral reform. To the extent there have been electoral reformers in the Labour Party, there have been just as vocal opponents of electoral reform. And the dominant position, I would argue, within Labour throughout its history has been to be broadly sceptical of most schemes of proportional representation.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do click follow or subscribe or whatever it is on the platform you listen on so that you can hear our future episodes. And next Sunday, we'll be back to talk about what I genuinely feel is the single most important electoral event of my lifetime, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. And just before that, on Thursday, we'll have our next instalment of Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.